This week on the Capitol Cable, martial law, political machinations, security, economic, commercial implications, all that and more with Michelle Lee, Washington Post, and the great Sid Seiler. Next on the Capitol Cable. Good evening to those in South Korea. Good morning to those in Washington, D.C. Good day to those around the world. Welcome to the 102nd installment of the CSIS Capitol Cable, a deadly serious topic here today, martial law, political machinations in South Korea. And with us, two of the very best special guests to cover us, one from the region live, one, of course, in D.C., and Victor, of course, always with us as well. But let me introduce our special guests here to walk us through these really important, critical, timely, salient issues here today. First, we have Michelle Ye Hee Lee, of course, is the Washington Post Tokyo Bureau Chief. She was a political reporter prior to her time in Asia with the Post, and prior to joining the Post was at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix. She is a proud graduate of Emory University, a great institution of which my sister also attended, and many prominent Koreans as well. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Good to be here. Good to have you with us, rather, here today. All right, of course, next up, Sid Seiler. Everybody knows Sid. 4+ decades in the intelligence community. I think, I don't know, maybe 4+ or minus decades. I'm not sure. I round up, Sid. So, of course, worked CIA, NSC, DNI, you name it, he's done it, USFK. He's done them all of the tours and is one of the most prominent Korea analysts, and of course had policy roles as well over at the State Department in terms of six-party talks envoy and all of that. Sid, welcome back to the program.
Mark, thank you. Great seeing you this morning.
Excellent. I won't go into your university because I think you were born into the analyst seat over in the intelligence community. I think you just went straight there, skipped adolescence, skipped university, and just went straight there. But of course, welcome back to the show. All right, and Victor, as always, great to see you. Everybody knows Victor. He's in charge of basically all, I think, now regional things at CSIS. I don't know, some sort of czar over at CSIS. But Asia, obviously, that includes the Asia portfolio and, of course, the Korea chair. He is a prominent faculty member over at Georgetown, Vice Dean Emeritus, Bush NSC, Defense Policy Board, you name it, Victor's done it as well in academic policy circles. Victor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Good to see you. I like the pink tie.
All right, excellent. Yes, I'm trying to be a little more sort of a gray, it's just a little more, I guess, colorful here in an otherwise pretty, a situation that could be described as drab. So let's put it that way. All right, Victor, thanks for being on the show. I'm going to turn to Michelle first. And if you notice, usually our guests will note the lack of long bio, lack of banter. The main reason is we wanted to get right into this, and this is really serious times here on the Korean Peninsula, and it's late there. But Michelle, thanks for staying up with us, and we just wanted, catch us up here if you don't mind, in terms of the last week plus events. I think many of us were surprised, shocked, insert the adjective there, to see what was going on in South Korea. And the events continue to turn right up until literally moments ago. You have a new piece out today. So if you wouldn't mind, just walk us through the arc here. And again, welcome back to the show.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been a wild time in Seoul. It began Tuesday night last week when President Yoon made a very shocking declaration of martial law. I mean, it was to a point where so many South Koreans I've spoken with were like, we thought it was fake news. We just didn't know exactly what was happening. It was unclear. And what unfolded was, military officers descending on the National Assembly to block assembly members from entering their chamber because having a majority of there to revoke martial law would have ended that period. Immediately, National Assembly members started rushing over there, so did thousands of protesters demanding a return to democratic government. Very powerful moment. And of course, President Yoon, his decision was reversed within less than 2 hours or so, just over 2 hours, by the National Assembly's vote, and then President Yoon formally revoked it 6 hours later. So it was an incredibly dramatic night, dramatic even in the terms of South Korean politics, which, as you all know, is very had lots of ups and downs. Since then, we've seen a failed impeachment vote as the party, People Power Party, rallied around the president initially. The party, there needs to be 8 defections from his party for the impeachment vote to be successful. Last week, there weren't enough votes to even have a quorum to even count the votes. This weekend, it seems like we're getting closer to a successful impeachment. So far, there are 7 public yeses from his party supporting impeachment. All they need is 8. And what's really turned since then is I think it's growing public anger over what's happened. President Yoon's really firm, digging his heels into the ground, refusing to resign despite many members of his own party just asking him to resign. Country completely in paralysis as the prime minister and the party leader wrest control of day-to-day activities from the president, which it's still not clear if it's legal, but they've done it anyway. The president hadn't shown up to work until today when he issued a 30-minute tirade against the opposition party, defending his own decision, and challenged them to impeach them or arrest him. And on top of that, we have an actual, prosecution case happening right now, criminal charges that the prosecution is looking to file, which would lead to an arrest of a sitting South Korean president, which would be the first time of a sitting incumbent president. So these are all the dynamics at play right now. What we're all looking toward is Saturday, the impeachment vote. And at the moment, like I said, we're just 1 vote shy. If the impeachment is successful, it leads to a months-long process. It just doesn't end right there. 6 months, up to 6 months of deliberation from the Constitutional Court, then up to 2 months of an election to replace President Yoon. So we're in this for many, many more months.
Okay, outstanding. Let me unpack this. Lots to unpack there, just in terms of and catching some of our viewers up, because Michelle, as always, you're operating at the graduate level. 401 course at Emory University, and just so we understand and level set here. First, in the National Assembly, there's 300 members, correct? And it takes 200 to impeach, correct? And the Democratic Party, which is the opposition party, has a majority. It's a unicameral system, and that the DP, as they are called, plus their coalition partners equal about 192 seats. So they need 8. That's where you get your 8 defections. Eight members of the PPP need to come over to join to equal 200. So that's one. I just want to make sure I was right there. The second point is if there is impeachment, then for those of following on in the U.S., the Constitutional Court plays the role of the U.S. Senate, basically, and has to make a decision about removal for office. And my understanding is it takes 7 justices to hear the case. There are 9 total, right? You have to have 7 to hear the case, although that's in dispute right now.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been so mired in the details. I've just kind of whooshed over all of these things. But yes, there are 9 spots on the court. At the moment, there are 6 judges. I believe three appointed by Yoon and 3 by his predecessor. The law says at least 6 votes are needed. So right now, that's in dispute whether there needs to be a 7th judge. That at the moment, the acting chief of the court said that it can still happen even without a 7th judge. We're just not clear yet. So that will be in play as well.
Yeah, and I was not to get mired in the, not mired, but not to get too far down the legal. I was reading some Korean press, and it basically talked about 7 to basically get a quorum. Right. But that is also in dispute, right, in a separate legal matter that's working its way through the court system. So complicated machinations there. But the bottom line here, Michelle, is that we're all focused on this Saturday vote. And coming back to that, there are 7 defections already. one more and you likely get impeachment, then we can talk about the court and all of its machinations. But then can I ask, so the question I have for follow-up is you outlined, I think, three scenarios. Maybe there's four, but one is possible arrest uh, as a sitting president. The second is impeachment. The third, I guess, is resignation. And then I guess fourth, you would say all others, right? Or others. What is the current thinking about what is going to happen next, based on your reporting out of Seoul?
Well, resignation is highly unlikely, so I would rate that as the lowest possibility based on what President Yoon has said today. He was incredibly defensive of his decision, believes he's totally in the right. Arrests seem to be the investigation seems to be closing in. The prosecutors they spoke with some members of his cabinet today. They seem to be closing in on the president. There are a couple different investigations happening, so they're all sort of rushing to see what they can do. And these are charges of insurrection against the president. And that's the only instance where you can actually arrest a sitting president in South Korea. I think that's the second more likely scenario, but at the same time, it could, and the most likely is impeachment this weekend, which could actually happen in conjunction with the arrest as well. So he could be impeached and be arrested. One doesn't negate the other.
And upon impeachment, Michelle, then the prime minister takes legal authority over the powers of the presidency. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, the prime minister ends up being the caretaker president until the new president is elected, after the Constitutional Court's decision. So in the meantime, up to 6 months, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo would be the interim president.
Okay, and last question, and I just want to get to your piece today. So Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, can you just tell us a little about him? I know he's a familiar face to many of us in Washington because he served as ambassador, among with virtually every other high-ranking position in the Korean government. Pretty interesting, remarkable individual. But a little bit about that, and then you talked a little bit in your piece today about the implications for the U.S. ROK alliance. Could you get into that as well?
Yeah, well, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, longtime civil servant, current number 2 in the government. He appears also to have been caught off guard by this martial law declaration. There was a 5-minute cabinet meeting right before he declared it, and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo seems to have opposed it at the time, but president went forward with it anyway. And Prime Minister Han he's at the moment has taken control of the day-to-day activities of the government. We don't know if that's actually legal since there is no actual vacancy at the presidency. But I think that's the prime minister's effort to try to show there is going to be stability in the company, some control at the country, some sense of control, although I don't know if the public is really buying it right now. The piece on the implications of the alliance, and I quoted Victor, so Victor could also explain too. But my question here was, big picture, what does this mean what are the implications here for the U.S. ROK alliance and the future of the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral relations? And I think it's kind of grim. We already knew there was going to be quite a rocky transition period with President Trump coming in. President Yoon was supposed to be the more stable figure in this relationship during that period, especially given that in Japan, Prime Minister Ishiba is having a tough time, as he's been newly elected and already unpopular. But then now the one guy who was supposed to be the anchor in the relationship out here is about to be gone. And as Victor noted, a lot of these allies are going to be trying to rush in to make inroads with the Trump team, get in on those conversations that they know are going to happen anyway, like SMA negotiations, like pulling out Trump troops maybe. But there's no one on the South Korean government side who's actively able to do that during this complete government paralysis that's happening. And that seems to be a bad sign, for now, at least for the alliance and for the trilateral as well.
All right, excellent. Once again, you've passed with flying colors. We peppered you with questions late at night. So let me turn to Victor as you rightly threw it to him. If the whole reporting thing doesn't work out for you, Michelle, there's a moderating gig in it for you at some point. So, I'm a little worried for my job here. But Victor, over to you. on this implications. First of all, your thoughts on the matters at hand, and then let's get to how Michelle definitely threw it to you in terms of the implications piece. I want to get to that, and then Sid, I'm going to come to you. Alliance North Korea, so be thinking ahead on that. Victor, muted here. You're muted. I think John Hamry came down and hit your mute button by accident as he strolled through your office.
We had breakfast this morning very early, and so I'm not fully awake. So so it was great laid down by Michelle. I'll on the whole question of the domestic politics, is make two quick points. The first is that as we know, the origins of this sort of go back to the midterm elections in Korea last spring, where the opposition party extended their majority and put them in a very good position to block everything that the government was doing. And in fact, that's what they did, including the budget, and that created a lot of anger and frustration on the part of President Yoon, which is part of what explained this. But as some folks on the call know, the roots of this are even much more deeply structural, right? In the sense that, as we know, Korea is a single 5-year presidential term. It makes every sitting president a lame duck at some point in that 5-year term, usually after the halfway point, and almost certainly after a midterm election in which the ruling party loses big time. So that's one. And then the other is the electoral constraint, which is, 1/3 of the South Korean public identifies as conservative, 1/3 is progressive, and 1/3 is somewhere in the middle, which means that any president is immediately politically vulnerable once they take office, because they're not coming in with a big mandate. And so all of these things come together, including sort of the very specific things that you and Michelle talked about that sort of takes us to where we are today. Second point is that it's like, from my perspective, like, like you, me, well, none of us have a dog in this fight. The only dog I have in this fight is I want to see democracy hold in Korea. Like, I don't want to see democracy and democratic institutions and constitutional processes fall apart. So in that sense, the actual best outcome here from that perspective is impeachment, right? Because we know we've seen it before. There's impeachment. There's a very specific path that's laid out, as Michelle described, involving the court, involving the prime minister, involving an election. The current situation is terrible, right? Where we have what is an extra constitutional power sharing arrangement between the PPP and the prime minister. Like nobody knows exactly what this thing is. Nobody knows who's the commander in chief. The government says he's still the commander in chief, but who knows, right? And so, and if he's arrested, like, that's also something we haven't seen before. So in a sense, like, the best outcome here is this weekend he's impeached and things move forward. On the alliance, so the biggest concern, as Michelle
Victor,
said,
before you get into the alliance, would you also consider resignation? Although Michelle forecasted as a lower probability outcome, would resignation also fit into the democracy holding bucket in your mind?
I mean, it would, in the sense that there is a process, right? The same sort of thing. There'd be the prime minister would become the acting president, and there would be a 60-day period, I think, for an election. But Yoon appears to be very clear about he does not want to do that now,
right.
And that he wants to be impeached and defend himself in a court of law. On the alliance, I'll just say that I think in many ways this is probably the worst case scenario for the start of Trump 2 and the U.S.-Korea alliance. Of course, there are people who will try to continue the connections, but the reality is that Trump is Trump, and the personal sort of leader-to-leader tie is very important. We had some former Trump folks here yesterday at CSIS, and they said it's not the first 100 days with Trump, it's the first 100 hours. That there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that'll come out on January 21st that could impact Korea. It could have to do with troops in Korea. It could have to do with tariffs. It could have to do with the CHIPS Act. It could have to do with a whole bunch of things. And there's nobody at home in Korea. There's nobody there. And as Michelle said, this can go on for a long time. This could go on for months. This could take us into the summer, or longer. And that is just a very bad scenario. And then the last thing is, what is disturbing to me about the impeachment motion is that there's reference to some of the foreign policy actions that President Yoon took. And that is, that's foreign policy, and you can disagree with foreign policy, but it's not I don't think, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that's not an impeachable offense. It may be something politically you disagree with, but it's not an impeachable offense. And so that does not bode well for what will happen with Korea's foreign policy once there's an election.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Excellent. Let me come to Sid. Sid, please build on anything Victor said on the domestic side, number one. And then number two, I want to get into with your specialty on North Korea, what they're doing. I've gotten a lot of questions about the implications there, but Sid, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And great comments, of course, by Victor and Michelle. I think, you know, at this point, we are all assuming impeachment, and in some ways, impeachment is really the start of the end game, right? Because it opens up this window in which President Yoon will have an opportunity to make his case in public, foot stomp, amplify a lot of the stuff he said in his statement overnight, statements that will resonate, like Victor described, the one third, one third, one third, maybe not at 33%, but at least at that 20%, support base that President Yoon seems to maintain. I think these are accusations of opposition, intransigence in the legislature, unwillingness to pass a budget, over and over impeachment of officials, gridlocking the ability of the government to function. These will resonate, but more importantly, these buy time, right? Because the real game here is the presidential election and who will be the next president of the Republic of Korea, and more specifically, whether the front runner in this race, Lee Jae-myung, who is under a number of accusations for irregularities, improprieties, etc., that if accelerated and these cases are closed up and he's put in jail, he won't be able to run. And if not, he will be able to buy time, move the election forward, and stand a chance at running. And it's interesting, it's worth noting that because this is where we pivot into the implications for the United States, North Korea, external issues. And Victor's right. The fact that they were included in the impeachment language is a troubling indication of the worst case scenarios, right? That we look at this and we say, we're going to see a return to something like, I've heard people call it the Moon Jae-in foreign policy on steroids, that they would definitively establish themselves as a intermediary with North Korea. They would seek to equidistance the ROK relationship with the United States and China, so that it's not necessarily a pro-China policy, but one that's less oriented towards the default, let's cooperate with the U.S. Position. Of course, trilateral comes into questions at that point, and if there's a antipathy or a hesitance to stay close to the United States, it's going to be amplified in terms of Japan. And then finally, a North Korea policy that's going to take another run at what President Moon had tried to do, but then leader Kim Jong-un refused to acknowledge. Now, I don't hold all of these positions. I think these are worst case scenario, and you can talk to a number of people around Washington. I think the ROK is already opposition party is already trying to improve the image of their foreign policy in Washington, so that we're not so alarmed that we could be potentially going back to an era where deterrence was difficult, reassurance was difficult. But for now, we do have to, as the complicating factor is that President Trump's taking over. The alliance was already going to come under close scrutiny, examination of why we do what we do, why we have as many troops as we have there, why we pay so much. And I don't know that we won't go back to a position where, hey, look, we've got a new government in Seoul that really is lukewarm to the United States, thinks they should be engaging North Korea. Why are we still there? Again, that's worst case scenario in it, just so that we can understand the context of where we are going forward.
All right, thanks, Sid. Victor, to you, let me come back to you, and then I'm going to come back to Michelle. We're going to work back here. On Sid's comments in terms of the alliance, and you mentioned this in your intervention, where are we likely to head? Put some more granularity on your predictions here, number one. And number two, what would you be thinking about in terms of possible outcomes, short term, medium term, for the alliance?
So I think it's pretty clear that we're going to see some sort of a large set of tariffs that are coming against allies and partners. Again, in Trump's thinking, in Trump's thinking, the United States average tariff rate is 2.7%, as one of our colleagues here at CSIS told us. The average tariff rate for the United States is 2.7%. The average tariff rate around the world is, I think, 13%. Um, and South Korea has a $51 billion trade surplus with the United States. So that combination of things in the Trump algorithm almost certainly means we're going to see 10% or more tariffs against Korea. And they may not come right away. The first action may be against China, but I think they'll certainly come in the period before South Korea has leadership. And then the game always is like, okay, so there's this tariff. So everybody goes to Mar-a-Lago or to the White House and then tries to cut a deal, right? Tries to cut a separate deal. And there is nobody in Korea who will be able to do that. So you have that issue. You also have the special measures agreement issue. As this was preemptively negotiated by the Biden administration to try to do a new agreement that would not raise the numbers in terms of South Korean cost sharing to as high as $5 billion, or now Trump says $10 billion, but raised it significantly as a way to preempt having this negotiation during Trump's 4 years in office, because as we all remember, this is what held up the alliance the last time around, where they could not reach an agreement. So he could easily tear that up and decide that he wants to set a new number. And again, there'll be people who will negotiate this at the negotiating level, but it won't be the same as because you will need high level political intervention, and that won't exist. So these are things I could see in the sort of short and medium term, barring anything happening with North Korea, which Sid could talk about. But in the longer term, my concern is we were in this period for the last few years where Korea was very much reconnecting with all of the coalitional efforts by democracies in the region on economic security, on democracy, on defense of Taiwan, freedom of navigation, war in Europe, all these sorts of things, really sort of reconnecting and becoming a very important player in things like the CHIPS 4 Alliance, all these sorts of things. And despite the great work of people like Mark Lippert and Sid Seiler and others, it's just not the same if you don't have a leader there. And they could easily sort of start fading back again to the point at which they were a few years ago, where we have this famous graphic that we produced. All of you have seen it, where there are these networks and these connections between India, the United States, Australia, Japan, all the major democracies in Asia. And there you see Korea sitting in the middle, not connected to any of these things, right? And my fear is that if Korea falls back to that position, it's not good for them. It makes them vulnerable economically and in terms of security. And overall, that's not good for Korea or for the alliance.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Good stuff there. Let me come to Michelle. Michelle, we talked a lot about the implications on the foreign policy side in terms of the alliance. We went down that road. Let me come back to the domestic scene a bit. And what I would really be interested in hearing from you are your insights on what is likely to happen in terms of the back and forth and the different machinations between the parties between now and a possible presidential election. Where are we headed? Who's jockeying for position? That's probably not a great word, but who's positioning themselves to run? What are the likelihoods of who is likely to run on the other side? And then if there is an election, how are these being looked at by the Korean people and by election experts in Korea?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the leading likely candidate, according to public polls, is Lee Jae-myung. Of course, that's going to depend on his own court appeal of his conviction in his own criminal case. I believe he has until May or June to actually still be able to run for office, but I believe when the final ruling comes down by June, he will be disqualified and he will have run out of appeals. So that's a ticking time clock. That's a ticking clock. I don't know. That's a timing element there that Lee Jae-myung has to consider. You're also seeing the political machinations of Han Dong-un. You know, he has sort of struggled to find his footing on where he stands on this last week. And that kind of led to the flip-flopping of some PPP lawmakers ahead of the impeachment vote. So Han wasn't fully really ready to assert himself as party leader and go against the president. But he and the president had already been having a falling out over the past few months. So I think it positioned Han to really be more comfortable and confident in opposing the president and pushing for his impeachment, especially after he found out that the president had called for the troops to go after Han as well as Lee Jae-myung. So once he found that out, he really turned and he started pushing for the president's ouster. But it's clear yet that Han Dong-un does not have the full support within his party. He still seems to be sort of on a weak standing. So that's why you saw not enough defections last week. But he is definitely gearing up to see if he can run for president as well. You know, part of this is if he succeeds in bringing the pro-Han faction along. So the PPP is really divided into pro-Yoon faction and pro-Han faction. The pro-Yoon faction still makes up the majority, but the pro-Han faction is powerful because they're right behind the party leader. And so if Han is successfully able to rally his faction around and start kind of chipping away at the pro-Yoon faction, he could start gaining more momentum for his candidacy. At the moment, though, his sort of bungled rollout over the past week or so about where he stands on the issue of democracy versus martial law has sort of weakened his credibility for now. But, you know, South Korean politics can switch so quickly. I think one final point I'll make about the domestic issue is that, you know, I've been taking sort of a big picture look at what has brought Yoon to this point. And today we finally got a clearer sense of his thinking through his 30-minute message about what was going on through his head. And, you know, it had really been I think it really comes down to the fact that he came into office with barely a mandate, less than 1% of the margin vote. And he's really not done much to expand that base. And he's, over the past 2.5 years, really dug his heels and been fighting the opposition party, increasingly becoming isolated as scandals whirl around his home, his party, his top officials. One of the issues that he cited today regarding the National Election Commission kind of goes back to some conspiracy theories that have been floated in far right-wing YouTube channels here in Korea. And he had been floating this for a few months, and it was kind of concerning to see it as his reasoning for bringing martial law and justifying martial law. I think you're sort of seeing a president who feels like he's reached the end of his, his patience. He feels frustrated. He decided the only way out of this was going to be martial law, and that he was going to send a message. I think that's a fundamental misreading of how the South Korean public was going to react to that. Perhaps he didn't care whether the Korean public was going to react badly. Perhaps he wanted to do it anyway. But I think it starts to really make sense why President Yoon felt like this was his sort of emergency pull button.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Really interesting insights there, Michelle. Let me pick up on a thread midway through that you got in terms of the back and forth between the parties and the different possible candidates. Is last time this occurred in South Korea about 10 years ago, give or take, the Conservative Party President Park Geun-hye was impeached, removed from office. Her successor then tried to run essentially for the presidency and was soundly defeated by Moon Jae-in, right? And are we looking at a similar type of scenario here in that the Conservative or the People's Power Party, the Korean political parties changed names a fair amount, the PPP will be running into stiff headwinds if they run? Is that a fair statement? I mean, what is the political landscape look like if impeachment comes all the way to the end and Yoon Suk Yeol is ultimately removed from office or resigns?
Yeah, I mean, currently, based on the public polling, Han Dong-hoon is not, he's not such an unlikely candidate for president. I think the dynamics are different in this case in that this has not been a months-long corruption scandal swirling the party, all standing behind Park Geun-hye. It's not really linked the party with the president in the same way that it did back then. It's becoming increasingly clear that this was a singular decision made by President Yoon with the advice of his high school best friend, Minister of Defense Kim Yong-hyun. And it's those two that the public are really holding to account, not necessarily the party. And I think that if the party does rally around him again this weekend, that could start to sort of snowball as an anti-PPP sentiment among the public. But at the moment, I think people are sort of able to and are separating what the party leader is trying to do on behalf of the party to really save the party, because he's asking the president, please leave, just leave our party so we don't have to impeach you, is what he's been saying. But Yoon's been refusing to do that. So the political dynamics here, I think people are able to sort of see this was a problematic decision by a problematic president that the public doesn't want to stand behind anymore. Something like 75% of people support impeachment now, and they're able to separate that as candidate Han Dong-un.
Okay, excellent. The last quick fast follow is just to tease out your one of your last points. That's precisely why the Conservative Party, the PPP, did not vote for impeachment last Saturday. Or maybe I should ask the question: why didn't they vote for it? It sounds like to me your answer is because they wanted to give Yoon Suk Yeol a chance to resign, right? Or am I misreading your answer here? I just wanted to clarify that.
Both. They wanted to give him a chance to resign, and they hadn't quite figured out the best way forward as a party yet. I mean, it was 4 days after the martial law. It was quite quick. But at the moment, they tried to buy time by asking the president to resign. That's why they boycotted the vote rather than voting against impeachment. They just didn't show up because they wanted to see if the president would just resign. And then if it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, then they could move forward with impeachment. And now the momentum is building toward impeachment.
Can I just say, Mark,
Yeah.
can I just say, so I think like my read on this back then was that the PPP, I mean, I agree with Michelle's analysis. My read on it back then was that the PPP saw resignation as a way for them to look like, to them to come out of this not stinking so much, right? If they're able to deliver the president's resignation, right, then they come out looking like they're helping to try to save the country rather than simply going with the DP last Saturday, in which they would look like complete losers, right? And I think, and they would get to delay this thing longer. The strategy fails, of course, when Yoon does an about face and says, "No, I want to be impeached now," right? So I want to be impeached, and I want my time in court, and so that makes it a much more difficult situation for Yoon. I mean, for Han Dong-hun and on this impeachment vote and trying to separate himself from the party and they're trying to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It's a really bad hand that they have, but they're doing their best to try to do this. And now the president's making it even harder for them.
Right.
Okay, well, last thing before
quickly.
Sid, I want to come to you on North Korea really quickly, but last thing on this, Victor, and Michelle, jump in here. Then why are there only 7 defections at this point? Is that to try to see if there will be a resignation between now and Saturday? Because as things get closer, you could change. What's the rationale that there are only 7 that have defected at this point?
I mean, I think it means the handwriting is on the wall. I mean, Yoon has pretty much said that he's not taking the resignation path. So,
Right.
So the handwriting's on the wall. I don't think the PPP has a choice now.
Right.
It really would surprise me if this doesn't go through this weekend. And then as Sid said, like we move to the next phase, right? We move to the next phase, which is the end game, which is of course the election. But that's still a long ways away, and a lot could happen.
Okay, let me come back to Sid. Sid, North Korea, I've tried to get it in. I failed. I'm not that good of a moderator. Michelle is looking for a job for my job. I know it. So, can you give us a couple minutes on North Korea? We're almost out of time, but please just give us a little bit on the North Korean reaction.
Well, first of all, it's very interesting that media across the ideological spectrum, but certainly that which is visible to us, and I won't, necessarily say whether I would include Michelle or not. It takes the idea that there was some North Korea dimension to this as some type of concocted excuse, and that this idea that, yeah, okay, probably the North Korea threat was not sufficient to justify the action, but the concern of pro-DPRK sentiments within the progressive camp is real. The concern of agents, that's a different question. But the idea that a return of the progressives would potentially lead the country into a direction that would diminish their deterrence capability as exercises are canceled again, strategic asset deployments are reduced again, and North Korea is seen just as a misunderstood brother rather than an existential threat to South Korea. There are real threats here, but because of the way that, you know, you can't even question the mechanics of what President Yoon is arguing in terms of the justification for his actions because the action is so outrageous from the beginning. So that's an unfortunate victim here, and I think this is what will unfold over the coming months, particularly if Lee Jae-myung's ties to North Korea and back when he was Gyeonggi-do governor come into play. The opposition's North Korea policy will come under greater scrutiny. For its part, Pyongyang is sitting and watching. Everybody knows the past few days we had the first DPRK media reaction to the events of last week. It was very interesting that there was a lot of quotation of third country media. In other words, we're not saying this, but according to Reuters, according to Yonhap, according to XYZ, these things are happening. And that's the way that Pyongyang is able to inform its people while at the same time maintaining the distance of not making any direct comment. There's a danger involved here, right? It's appearing on page 6 on the Nodong Shinmun, according to their website. And that will be North Koreans looking at citizens rising up against a seated leader. I mean, what does that tell you? Even as they criticize democracy, they're demonstrating what it looks like. Nobody in North Korea has that ability to do that. In the near term, I was saying prior to this event that the next lethal kinetic serious provocation would likely come after the inauguration because it's wasted on the Biden team. It will shape policy under the Trump team. I'm thinking now that North Korea may be in a position where, you know, because the message has got to be for the opposition to have its way, that the Yoon administration dangerously raised tensions on the peninsula by listening to the United States, entering into trilateral cooperation, trashing the PRC-ROK relationship, and not talking to North Korea. That's the position that Pyongyang will want to foster. And right now, there's not sufficient tension to add legitimacy to that. Kim may see in the coming months, particularly after the inauguration, an opportunity to really make South Korea have to make a choice of engagement or on Pyongyang's terms, capitulation on Pyongyang's terms, or standing up in a way that they'll be certain the opposition won't be ready to do. So for now, again, to make it more simple, short term, North Korea is probably a watch and see mode. As we get a few months down the road, however, we should be concerned about how North Korea might exploit this situation.
Okay, thanks. We're over time, but I'm going to go 30 seconds to Victor, 30 seconds to Michelle to close us out. Victor, just a comment to you on Sid's point on the North Korea, I guess, influence question. Sid frames it more in terms of there are political and policy disputes, right, that could be extant. And not sufficient justification for martial law, right? So your thoughts on that, and then anything else in 30 seconds.
So on the North Korean response, I'll remind everybody of when Kim Il-sung was watching the coup in South Korea taking place in 1979. Ceausescu asked him, like, would he do anything? And he said, no, I'm going to sit back and watch this. Like, I'm just going to watch it, right? And so I think that's what we're going to see here. And then on the point about post-inauguration North Korean action, absolutely. I mean, we saw it, like, you remember it, you guys remember it well, like when the Obama administration came in, we saw a nuclear test. When Trump came in, we saw a thermonuclear test. And we didn't see one during Biden, but they were in COVID lockdown. So true to form, I certainly do expect something really in the first quarter after the inauguration.
Okay, Michelle, 30 seconds to you to close us out here.
30 seconds. What I've been thinking about today is that it's actually December 12th talking about that coup in 1979, right? It has been on the minds of so many South Koreans I've talked to all over social media. The moment that the martial law happened, people were imposing Yoon's face on Chun Doo-hwan's portrait, merging the two. And I've been thinking about the movie 12/12 The Day, which is also called Seoul's Spring, because it came out a year ago. It's been really in the zeitgeist in Korea, and I wonder what role it has had in sort of this public awareness of this moment. Because I remember walking out of the theater and overhearing these like Gen Z millennial Koreans being like, using curse words to talk about Chun Doo-hwan and saying like, I didn't realize it was that bad. And elderly Koreans being like, well, that was bad. And that's sort of been the sentiment here. And I just wonder how much this moment is resonating with the public, just because 12/12 Chun Doo-hwan has been like highly watched on Netflix for so long and in the theaters. This past week, it's been #1 on Netflix in South Korea. So I think it's a very of the moment issue here, as well as Hangang's Nobel Literature Prize that dealt with Gwangju. So these cultural moments are really colliding with this political moment right now.
Oh, really interesting stuff there. All right, Michelle, uh, I almost feel like we can't leave it there, but it's so good. We want to go more, but we're out of time. So please come back. We want to explore this at some more depth on these different cultural pieces linking up with the political situation here. Really interesting stuff. I should have led with that. Anyway, so again, another moderator fail, but we had, notwithstanding the poor performance by the moderator today, thank you to the guests for carrying us through an excellent show, full of insights, full of analysis. Thanks to Michelle for staying up late with us. Sid, as always, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. Victor, usual bang up job, terrific. And I did like that you and Mike Green were reunited in Michelle's piece today, albeit over a distant ocean, but it was all good to see. So thanks, everybody. Check out Michelle's piece. It's really good today. And see everybody in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.